All right, welcome to another deep dive where we take a bunch of your sources and really boil them down into, those key ideas that you need to know to basically become an expert fast.
That's it. No information overload here.
Yeah,
It's just
good.
those aha moments you really want.
Exactly.
This time, it's all about how education looks from a post-colonial perspective.
Okay.
And we've got some interesting writings from Molte von Molzahn,
Right. Yeah.
Judith Kuntz, and Florence Eckert to guide us.
Perfect.
But what makes this one really fascinating is the person who's sort of walking us through these ideas.
Oh, okay.
It's Fernando Andia Kochachi.
Okay.
And he does a lot.
Right.
For example, he trains educators through Bildungsentwicklung, which I think translates to like education meets development.
Right. Right.
But he's also involved with Chet Dervelton, and he founded the Toupi Group too.
Wow. Busy guy.
Yeah, and across all this work, he's really focused on a few key areas: children's rights, climate justice, but specifically from a global South perspective.
Makes sense.
Fair trade, colonialism, racism.
Oh, wow. Big topics.
Yeah, really important stuff. He even has this award-winning film project called Deutsch sein aus allen Himmelsrichtungen, which I think means being German from all directions.
Interesting.
It's really powerful stuff.
Well, that's a great intro to Fernando. Now, I know you mentioned he kind of walks us through these ideas, but where does he actually begin?
Well, he often starts with, believe it or not, dreams.
Dreams, like sleeping dreams.
Yeah, exactly. He actually has this recurring dream about this green place, like a lush forest, and it feels ancient, like full of history, but also kind of foreign to him at the same time.
Okay.
It's like he's constantly exploring it, trying to understand it.
That's a pretty vivid image, but what does that have to do with education?
It really gets at his core belief that learning, true learning, is all about exploring and being in this constant state of flux, of adapting to new information.
Adapting.
He's really big on real in-person connections,
Okay.
like face-to-face interactions,
Interesting.
not just screens and text.
Yeah.
To really drive this point home, he actually uses this piece of sequoia bark in his work.
Sequoia bark.
Yeah, think about it, sequoia trees. They live for centuries, right?
Right.
So the bark represents this longevity, this resilience, and it's something tangible, something you can hold, something that evokes emotion.
I see. So it becomes more than just an abstract idea.
Exactly. It makes learning this shared experience something you connect with on an emotional level. For him, education isn't about just passively absorbing information. It's about learning with someone, finding yourself in connection with others.
Right, that makes sense. It's like that South African concept of Ubuntu.
Yes, exactly. That
Yeah.
I am because you are idea.
That feeling of interconnectedness, that we're all in this together.
Absolutely. And that's key to Fernando's philosophy.
Mhm.
He doesn't see ideas as, something someone just comes up with on their own. For him, they emerge in those encounters, in those interactions between people.
Okay.
Think of that quote by Francois Rabelais. He said, "Children want not to be like barrels filled, but like torches kindled."
Torches kindle? Yeah.
It's about sparking something, not just cramming information in.
That's a good one. But, thinking about that spark, I'm guessing it can look pretty different depending on the culture you're in, right?
Absolutely. Some European thinkers back in the day actually criticized the oral traditions and the way knowledge was conveyed through pictures in pre-Hispanic cultures.
Oh.
They said it was too fluid, too ambiguous.
Okay, but how does Fernando see that fluidity?
Well, for him, that's actually a strength. He argues that when knowledge is passed down through storytelling, through retelling, it's constantly being reshaped by the present moment.
Okay.
It adapts, it evolves. It's a living thing, not just some static record locked in a book.
I can see that. And I guess that spontaneity and how it's conveyed probably plays a part in how it's understood too, right?
Exactly. It allows for a deeper level of understanding, what the Germans call begreifing.
Begreifen.
Yeah, it means like grasping with your senses, really getting it, not just verstehen, which is more like intellectual understanding.
Ah, I see. So it's not just about knowing the facts, it's about experiencing them, feeling them.
Exactly. And Fernando uses this really interesting example to illustrate how our usual way of thinking, our assumptions about the world, might not be the only way.
What's the example?
He has this picture that fills from the bottom.
From the bottom.
Yeah, it's counterintuitive, right? Most pictures you fill from the top.
Right, of course.
But this one, you flip it over and fill it from the bottom.
Wow, that is counterintuitive.
It makes you stop and think, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does.
It shows that our way of doing things isn't the only way. And it makes you wonder, where do these ideas about how things should be even come from?
That's true. We often take things for granted, like the idea of efficiency, without really questioning where it came from.
Exactly. And that concept of efficiency is so tied to industrialization, to this very linear view of time.
Yeah, like time is money.
Exactly.
Whereas the Mayans, for example, they had multiple calendars reflecting different rhythms, different ways of experiencing time.
Exactly. And you even see this with kids, right?
How so?
Like siblings. One might be really good at focusing for long periods, while another thrives on short bursts of activity.
Right, they have different learning styles.
Exactly. And Fernando has this really interesting tool he uses to explore these different ways of approaching things. It's a dice game.
A dice game. Okay, tell me more.
So imagine you're playing this game, but the rules change at different tables.
So what works at one table might not work at another.
Exactly. It really breaks down this idea that there's one right way to do things, one superior approach. It challenges those assumptions.
That's clever.
And there's this really powerful story he tells about an asylum seeker who was playing the game.
Okay.
Now, this person didn't speak the language very well,
Right.
but they were amazing at the game.
Really?
Yeah, they were figuring out the rules, adapting, and winning, even though everyone else assumed they would struggle.
That's really interesting. It reminds me of how, during colonialism, European ways of doing things were often imposed on other cultures as if they were the only correct way.
Exactly. It was all about devaluing alternative solutions, different ways of knowing and being.
And that brings us to decoloniality.
Right. It's this whole way of looking at how this European idea of modernity, the way they saw the world, created this center and a periphery,
Okay.
and how that division, that power dynamic, is still with us today.
That makes sense.
It's about questioning this assumption that one way of knowing, one way of being, is the only right way, the universal way.
Right, so it's not about rejecting everything from Europe.
No, not at all.
It's about critically examining the power structures and the assumptions that came along with colonialism.
Exactly. And it affects so many different areas of life.
Like what?
Well, think about urban planning. In many parts of the world, cities that weren't built according to European models were labeled as not modern, as if there was only one way to build a city.
Right, or how certain forms of knowledge were privileged over others.
Exactly. Like universities and dissertations became the way to produce knowledge, the gold standard, so to speak.
And other forms of knowledge transmission, like oral traditions, were dismissed or even actively destroyed.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's important to note, even some European thinkers were critical of these aspects of their own culture.
Right, like who?
Well, you have people like Schopenhauer,
Okay.
Marx, Horkheimer, and Adorno,
Jimum.
Heidegger. They all had their critiques.
Interesting. But Fernando contrasts European symbols of power,
Yeah.
like gold, which represents extraction and ownership,
Right.
with Mesoamerican ideas of theocracy, where leaders were seen as having a temporary responsibility connected to the earth and the cosmos.
Exactly. And they used renewable resources like Quetzal feathers as symbols of power. Yeah, think about it. Feathers, they're beautiful, but they're also delicate. They eventually fall away.
Showing that power is fleeting, it doesn't last forever.
Exactly. It's a very different perspective from the European dynasties that were
Mm.
all about establishing enduring power, amassing wealth that would last for generations.
So what can we learn from all this? What can we take away from these pre-Columbian traditions?
One key idea is that knowledge doesn't belong to any one person or group.
Okay.
It belongs to everyone, or perhaps to no one. It's like a spark that ignites a fire.
A spark.
Yeah, think about it. The spark doesn't own the fire, right?
Right.
It sets it in motion, it inspires it, but the fire has its own life, its own energy.
I like that analogy. So passing on knowledge is like passing on that spark.
Exactly. And each person who receives that spark can then use it to ignite their own fire, to share it with others.
That's a powerful image. It really gets at the idea of knowledge as something shared, something that grows and evolves as it's passed on.
Exactly. And Fernando uses this really interesting example to illustrate how our own cultural biases can sometimes blind us to other ways of seeing the world.
Oh, what's that?
He talks about the snake.
Okay.
In Christianity, the snake is often seen as a symbol of temptation,
Yeah.
evil, right?
Right.
But in some Mexican cultures, it might have a completely different meaning. It
Okay.
might represent healing or transformation or something else entirely.
So by imposing our own interpretation, we might be missing out on a whole other layer of meaning.
Exactly. And it's important to acknowledge that sometimes destroying or suppressing other forms of knowledge has been a deliberate strategy throughout history.
To maintain power, to control the narrative.
Exactly. While Fernando recognizes the benefits that have come from European individualism, he also challenges us to ask ourselves, how easy is it to really critique a system that you're a part of?
Right, to step outside of our own comfort zone, our own assumptions.
Exactly. And to move beyond this idea of knowledge as something we own, something we control.
It's about letting go of that need for power, for control, and embracing this more fluid, more reciprocal way of learning and knowing.
Exactly. And in Peru, there's this tradition called AYN, which means reciprocity.
AYN.
Yeah, it's about this balance of giving and taking.
Okay.
So when Fernando gives someone that piece of sequoia bark, it's not just a symbolic act, it's a personal exchange.
And what's he hoping to receive in return?
Not necessarily something tangible, but rather questions.
Questions.
Yeah, he wants people to engage with the ideas, to challenge them, to come away with more questions than answers.
It's about sparking curiosity, igniting that desire to learn more.
Exactly. There's this Mayan saying, we only move forward by recognizing our contradictions.
Recognizing our contradictions, I like that.
It's about embracing those moments of tension, of uncertainty, as opportunities for growth.
Because that's where the real learning happens, right? When we're forced to confront our assumptions, to step outside of our comfort zone.
Exactly. And that's what AYNI is all about. It's about seeing those contradictions, not as obstacles, but as opportunities for deeper understanding, for a more reciprocal relationship with knowledge.
So it's not just about taking in information. It's about giving something back, contributing to the conversation, asking questions.
Exactly. And that's why those objects, like the bark, are so important.
They're not just props.
No, they're meant to represent lived experience, to evoke emotions, to make the learning process more personal, more engaging.
Because ultimately, learning isn't just about thinking, it's about feeling. It's about connecting with the material on a deeper level.
Exactly. Leonard Cohen said, there's a crack in everything. That's what the light gets in.
That's a good one.
And I think those cracks are what allow us to see things in a new light, to break free from those rigid frameworks that can sometimes limit our understanding.
It's about being open to new possibilities, to different ways of knowing and being.
Exactly. And education, true education, should be this collective experience, something we do together, something that fosters joy, trust, and a sense of shared purpose.
It's about creating a space where people feel safe to explore, to question, to make mistakes, and to learn from each other.
Exactly. And sometimes that means recognizing that power structures can actually be harmful, especially in those sensitive spaces where people are trying to learn and grow.
So it's not just about dismantling those structures, it's about creating something new, something more equitable, more just, more human.
Exactly. And that brings us to this really interesting point. Sometimes intuition or empathy can be more reasonable than just relying on logic or reason alone.
What do you mean?
Well, think about conflict resolution.
Okay.
Sometimes just trying to talk things out to argue your point can actually make things worse.
Right.
But when you approach a situation with empathy, with a willingness to understand the other person's perspective, that's when real breakthroughs can happen.
So it's not about ignoring our rational minds. It's about recognizing that there are other ways of knowing, other ways of being in the world.
Exactly.
So for you, the listener, remember what we've talked about today. The importance of emotional connection and learning, the need to constantly question our assumptions, the richness that comes from embracing diverse perspectives, and the power of reciprocity, of giving and receiving.
It's about seeing knowledge not as something to be possessed, but as something to be shared, something that grows and evolves as we pass it on.
So as you continue on your own learning journey, ask yourself, how can I apply these ideas to my own life?
What sparks of understanding can I ignite by questioning those familiar rules and embracing new ways of knowing?
That's our deep dive for today. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening.